What's up, you guys? This is Rhetorician Ruby.
And this is Analytic Andrew.
And we are here today with a really, really interesting topic. We're going to be diving deep into the Alabama state abortion ban.
We've got lots of great information for you guys today. So first of all, thank you for tuning in, and let's go ahead and get started.
All right, I'm going to start with a quote from our former First Lady, Michelle Obama. "No country can ever truly flourish if it stifles the potential of its women and deprives itself of the contribution of half of its citizens."
Now, Michelle Obama's words here about the importance of maintaining equality for women, they coincide really well with the hot topic of America's current political climate, which is like Ruby said, the Alabama state abortion bans.
Although abortion has always been prone to political dialogue characterized by turmoil and conflict, new proposed laws in certain states have resurfaced strong emotions on both sides of the spectrum.
Now, recall the monumental court case Roe v. Wade in the early 1970s, which gave women the right to safe means of abortion in lieu of the right to privacy, which is promised by the 14th Amendment of the Constitution.
Roe v. Wade was an extremely significant Supreme Court case prior to its passing. Abortion was not only deeply frowned upon, but only allowed under super extreme and strict circumstances.
And as Rhetorician Ruby said at the beginning, this podcast is going to dive deep into the rhetorical situation of Alabama's newly proposed abortion laws and examine the ways that rhetoric can help individuals like us better understand the ways that these harmful laws can manifest and what that process shows about power structures in America's political spheres.
So, ultimately, power creates circumstances in which the in-group can enact legislation that materializes in ways that serves the interest of those in power and disenfranchises those who are considered the outgroup.
And today we are going to be going over what these abortion laws are exactly, how they were put in place, and then we're going to look at the impact they might have by tying in various rhetorical concepts about material rhetoric as well as power.
So, for those of you who don't know, if you live under a rock, the Alabama senators voted on Tuesday, May 14th, to ban virtually all abortions in the state, including circumstances of rape and incest, which is the strictest law the nation has ever seen, which is expected to be signed and has been signed.
Perfect. And note that the measure permits abortion only when necessary to save a mother's life. So although it is very strict, there is one circumstance that they would allow, and that is if the case involves saving the mother's life, then that's when abortion would be allowed. Other than that, there's basically no exceptions.
So the Alabama bill, which was passed 25-6, is even more restrictive than any other prior state abortion laws and includes a penalty of up to 99 years in prison for doctors who perform abortions, which, fun fact, is actually longer sentencing than if you were to commit rape in Alabama. Alabama is the first state to pass a law like this in nation's history, and it's going to be really interesting to see how the dialogue plays out.
Before we kind of dive deeper into the rhetorical situation, it's important to go over Roe versus Wade, which was the court case that allowed abortion to become legal. It's very important to have a holistic understanding so that we can be kind of situated in the context of what's going on here. So Roe versus Wade basically set the precedent for legal abortion in America. It was Jane Roe versus Henry Wade. Henry Wade was a Dallas attorney who enforced a Texas law that prohibited abortion, and Jane was fighting against that, Jane Roe. So the general timeline kind of looks like this. In December of 1971, that was the first time the case was argued before the Supreme Court. Fast forward about a year, in October of 1972, the case was then re-argued before the Supreme Court for a second time. Fast forward again about another year, in January of 1973 was the 7-2 decision which granted women's rights to have an abortion in accordance with the 14th Amendment. Note that in 2003, Roe versus Wade was challenged, just like what's happening today again. So it's important to recognize that Roe versus Wade in 1973 kind of set a precedent for legal abortion and has been debated interchangeably since then, but now we're looking at an entirely new, different situation.
Right. We sort of use Roe v. Wade as a standard to gauge any other court cases off, and what we're going to get into in a little bit is how these Alabama abortion laws are looking to, yes, change Alabama legislation, but ultimately overthrow the Roe v. Wade decision and sort of how that's significant rhetorically. I also think it's really important to discuss the context of this ban and sort of what's been going on to help explain why this is happening now. I think recently the political climate has been very polarized, especially on women's health initiatives with abortion. Election of a president like Donald Trump has definitely shifted the tides for women in America. I think having someone who's been accused of sexual harassment and has been quoting to grab a woman by the pussy definitely has sort of opened the floodgates for us as a society to tolerate that sort of behavior and to normalize talking about women in such a way. And I think that's ripe for a circumstance like an abortion ban to happen.
You definitely bring up a very important point, rhetorician Ruby. When we look at the ways that electing a person like Donald Trump into office, and you look at the ways that harmful ideologies are kind of reaffirmed and reinforced, it's really important to recognize the ways that basically electing someone like Donald Trump can reinforce harmful mindsets and harmful viewpoints, especially in terms of women's rights.
Right. So the Trump administration announced in February of 2019 that it will bar organizations that they provide abortion referrals from receiving federal family planning money. And this could essentially strip millions of dollars from Planned Parenthood and direct it towards anti-abortion groups or any religiously based groups, which completely strays away from the point of women's productive health and sort of what Planned Parenthood does. Planned Parenthood doesn't just do abortions. They do cancer screenings, birth control, education, sex education help. There's a lot more to it than just abortion, which is super unfortunate.
Perfect. So, although it's clear that these legislative passings jeopardize specific women's rights, rhetorical theories and concepts can help us uncover truths about both short-term and then also long-term impacts that these laws would produce. And understanding these events through rhetorical ideas and rhetorical perspectives can also magnify the power of whiteness in America and thus spark individual action that can help challenge and dismantle power sources like the men that are voting on laws that determine a woman's physical body autonomy.
So now Andrew and I are going to each get into the two rhetorical theories that we thought did a really good job at highlighting what's going on in the abortion ban. I'm going to be talking about material rhetoric first. So what is material rhetoric? The scholar of communication of rhetoric, Carol Blair, details the effects and consequences of a rhetoric's material manifestation. So essentially, material rhetoric gets at how the world was changed as a result of a speech or text, sort of like a ripple in our lived experiences. And what we're going to be doing with this example of Alabama's abortion ban is applying material rhetoric at how rhetoric was used in Alabama's legislation to materialize itself in society and how that impacts actual lives. So this rhetoric has the potential to impact women's ability to make decisions about their own body, which is really intense. With this case study, the creators of the legislation, or the rhetors, will you say, were the Alabama senators who created and voted on the bill. Who are these rhetors? Well, they are 25 white males who very clearly do not have to deal with the consequences of their rhetorical decisions. And these decisions have materialized themselves as consequences and are put on the women. And thus, they don't get to make decisions about their own body.
How ironic is it that 25 white males voted on a law that directly affects none of them and only affects women?
Right. It materializes it so that women are the ones who no longer get to make decisions about their own body, and they are not able to take action if they want to. The bill that they voted on definitely has direct rhetorical legislative power over any woman in Alabama. These women are no longer able to make independent decisions about their own bodies. And I think there's something to be said about effect versus consequences. That's a big portion of what material rhetoric gets at. And I think if you follow anyone on Facebook who's pro-life, or you see on Twitter, or you sort of see in the news, a big effect that people who are pro-life say is that they want to save the lives of innocent children as fetuses. They sort of want to protect children in the sense that if a child has a heartbeat in the womb, that it's a child and it's murder. But I think the consequence of that is sacrificing women's individual liberty to make decisions about their own body. And so I think that's the reality of the situation with the Alabama abortion ban, is that while maybe their effect is to try and save children, the actual consequence is an infringement on individual liberty.
You know, a lot of what you're saying, Ruby, is reminding me of just like the general takeaway about material rhetoric, and basically how this example of rhetoric within the Alabama abortion bans is that while it takes place as a written down text, it's important to remember the materiality of it and how that's constantly present. So once this legislation is kind of put out into the world and put out into the rhetorical spheres that enact discussion, that materiality and that material is constantly alive, it's constantly enacted, and it's perpetuated within future discourse.
Exactly. And I think it's also super interesting to pay attention to social media and news coverage of these, because we definitely are constantly reminded of what happened with the Alabama abortion ban. We see people's opinions and takes on it, and Twitter and Facebook and whatnot. And I think it's definitely hard to forget the materiality and the reality of the situation. I also think indirectly the materiality has made a national statement about the conversation about how we address women's rights with abortion. The Alabama abortion ban is sort of less about women in Alabama, but more about women all over the United States. The goal being using this new legislation to fight the standing federal ruling of legal abortion as established in Roe v. Wade. I think it's really interesting that Eric Johnson, the president of the Alabama Pro-Life Coalition, was quoted saying that we want to stop abortion of unborn children, and the only way we can do that is to go back and revisit the Roe v. Wade decision.
It's important, a lot of what you're saying, Ruby, is actually reminding me of something else that I saw. As of 2019, it's noted that 16 states have passed or are working to pass bans on abortion after a doctor can detect what they call a, quote, fetal heartbeat in the womb, which usually occurs about at 6 weeks. So it's clear to see that the materiality of this Alabama abortion ban is transferring itself into other states, because we see that 16 other states are now working at passing similar, if not equally as discriminatory laws about abortion. So that's an important thing to recognize too.
Right. Yeah, and what's crazy is 6 weeks. Most people don't even know they're pregnant at 6 weeks. So this is a really similar ban. It's not an abortion ban, but it's extremely similar. And it's really interesting to see how that rhetoric has spread to other states as sort of a movement of small attacks on trying to just overturn Roe v. Wade in general. I think the point is that the rhetoric of this abortion ban has materiality that surpasses just the text itself. It impacts women's decisions and actions, as well as the shape of discourse federally.
Okay, so now that we've kind of dove deep into the idea of materiality, it's important to look at another concept, which is power. A rhetorician and communication scholar by the name of Foucault talks about power in terms of two concepts coming together to create one larger idea. So those two concepts are exclusion and control. And there's basically some tools that he describes that are used to enact exclusion, and those tools include things like exclusion, like separation, like marking or branding. And the end goal of exclusion is to create a pure community in the eyes of the power source. And then as far as control goes, there's other tools to kind of enact control. And those tools include segmentation, training, and distribution. And then the end goal here is to create an ordered society. So when you have exclusion and control successfully enacted, you're going to get a pure community, an ordered society, and that comes together what Foucault describes as disciplinary power, which is this idea of constant surveillance that can be exercised through branding. Branding as in like shaping what's normal and what's considered abnormal, and then adding like assignments to individualities and their identities, like who they are, where they should be, how they're recognized, and in the end that's going to create in-groups and out-groups and continue to perpetuate this idea of the correct way of being. So tying those ideas into tying exclusion, tying control, and then the idea of just disciplinary power as a whole together with facts and examples of the Alabama abortion ban is super important in understanding how these concepts work. So note that in 2014, it was recorded that 93% of Alabama counties had no clinics that provided abortions. And that's a clear example of exclusion because you're excluding women in Alabama from easy access to abortion. And note that Alabama does not even include abortion in the list of healthcare services that people with low incomes get through Medicaid, which is the government-assisted health insurance. And that here is another clear example of exclusion in the ways that power sources are excluding individuals and their subordinates from human right resources. And so when these acts of exclusion are added, that continues to fuel the power sources and fuel how those in authority are able to perpetuate their control over their people.
Right. Not everyone can get in a car and drive to a state that has abortion also. Not everyone can fly somewhere that can take care of it or pay for a doctor at a state. It should be a right that everyone can access that. It's sort of further disenfranchising and sort of like growing disparity between those who can afford good health care and those who can't, and those who can afford abortions and those who cannot. It's really unfortunate.
Exactly. That's a very good point to think about. It's although these bans haven't actually taken effect yet, this example of how scarce abortion clinics are in Alabama is a representation of where things are going and where things will continue to go if action isn't taken against it. And note that an independent poll released in January of 2019 found that 73% of Americans believe that abortion should be legal in most and or all cases. And so what's interesting here is that even though the majority of Americans believe in a woman's right to abortion, these bans are directly going against exactly what people don't want. And that speaks to how impactful like having power is.
Right. And like I think it's really important to think about the power structure that we've set up in America and how we've sort of come to have all white legislators that are men making the decisions that clearly aren't very representative of the state or the country.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that just sort of dates back to like the 1700s when we signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and established this sort of order that hasn't really been changed since then.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're sort of starting to see people of color, women, minorities, people with disabilities entering the legislative sphere, but for the most part, power has been given to those in society who are not marginalized or disenfranchised, and that's not very representative of the reality of what's going on in America. And that's sort of why we're having the problem that we're having right now with the Alabama abortion ban, because the people who are making the laws, who have the power, are materializing rhetoric that affects not themselves, that affects people who don't really have a say in what's going on, which is super unfortunate.
Exactly. I think we've dove pretty deep into the idea of power and the idea of materiality and how this relates to the Alabama abortion bans, and we could talk about this for hours, but I think it's important to kind of take a step back and look at some key takeaways.
Yeah, it's important to recognize that the words that make up the legislative description of these bans have a perpetuating impact on people's lives, and that these ideologies are going to dictate the discourse that decides these laws. The weight of what has been said in those Alabama courtrooms and what has been written down in legislation has consequences. The manifestation of these rhetorical changes in the course of people's lives and families is unprecedented. It's important to remember that these are real and not to take them lightly. Going forward, being able to find materiality and rhetoric can be a tool to help fight social justice and create change.
Exactly. So tied in with that, it's also important to recognize the way that those in power accumulate and perpetuate their authority through acts of exclusion and control. So basically by passing legislation that disadvantages others with the intent to serve their own interests, resources and accessibility towards natural human rights become scarcer. And this is a domineering cycle that continues to occur in which those in power continue to fuel the fire that provides them the control that they covet and that they want and that they don't want to lose.
Thank you guys for tuning in. We have a list of works cited resources. If you guys are curious where we got our information, we're going to attach that. Otherwise, thank you for listening. Analytic Andrew and myself had tons of fun researching and talking about this. Make sure to tune in next week for our discussion on Bitzer versus VATS. I've decided my side. Andrew's decided his. So tune in to see who we think is correct.
And for the first time, we may actually disagree on something.
It's pretty crazy.
So make sure to tune in, listen closely. Until next time.
Thank you guys. Bye-bye.